Hello, ich bin Jobst Bittner.
Hello, my name is Jobst Bittner and I'm author of the book about breaking the veil of silence. This book has been a best-selling book for many years and it's been translated into 12 languages by now, and I am very glad to be able to tell you that you can read it in your language as well. So let me show you, it's very beautifully designed as well, but what's more important is the content. And I would like to share a few things about the content now, so you understand what the book is about. A veil of silence is present in every country, every city, and every family. And of course, it has a different form and shape in every country, but it has greater effects on us than we would care to imagine. In this book, I share the story of our city. It's the story of our fathers and grandfathers, and even great-grandfathers, who were part of the German Wehrmacht as soldiers in the Second World War and who became murderers and mass murderers. And later, when they returned from the Second World War, they were silent and they did not speak about the things they had done or seen. And I'm sharing the story of a war generation who denied their own history, who repressed them and kept silent. Many times they just pushed them aside, all of their traumas and their fears, and this was then transmitted from generation to generation. And I share the story of our city of Tübingen in the book. This is a small university town in southern Germany, and at the time of the Nazi movement, they became the training place of the leaders of many of the SS Einsatzgruppen, and personally they were responsible for the deaths of 700,000 Jews. One of them was the leader of the SS Einsatzgruppe, Walter Stahlecker. He grew up in Tübingen, he went to school here, he studied at the university, and he was responsible for the mass murder of 100,000 Jews, or even more than that, hundreds of thousands of Jews in the Baltic states. The Holocaust was only possible because the majority of the people just stood by and watched. And they remained silent in the face of anti-Semitism and hatred of Jews. And when people look away and remain silent, hatred of Jews and anti-Semitism is actually passed down from generation to generation. In every nation, there are places of remembrance and of commemoration. Historians have worked and researched history so many times in an exemplary way, but still, commemoration somehow seems to have passed by the majority of the people. And there is one place where silence can be passed on, and these are actually our very own families. And this is my thesis to start off with. As long as the silence in the families has not been broken yet, the history of guilt of a nation will repeat itself. And indifference in the face of hatred of Jews and anti-Semitism will be passed on from generation to generation. I will present these thoughts in my book in detail, but before I do that, I am very glad to be able to welcome Kimi Kasch and Samuel Haas here in the studio with me. They will share their stories. But first of all, Kim Kasch, she's a university student and musician. And now what's your story? And why is it so important for your generation to break the veil of silence? Well, thank you so much, Jobst. Well, I'm 22 years old. And so, of course, history of the Second World War is quite some way back. But I can remember when at school we were talking about the topics of the Second World War and the Holocaust. It was history, it was numbers, you know, hundreds of thousands of victims. It was bad, but it was quite remote. And for many, and myself too at the time, but many in my generation, it remained rather impersonal. And as you mentioned before, and as you shared about your book, I read your book as well. And to me, it really was a key, personally, to start looking into my own family history. Because then the mere figures and numbers you hear suddenly receive a face and they become very personal. And so I started asking questions. What happened with my great-grandfathers at the time? And then I discovered that one of my great-grandfathers was in Kaunas in 1941 from June to September, and I also was there in that place in the museum of the Ninth Fort. And all of a sudden I knew, right here in this place, my family was involved. So I personally believe that this truly is a key to start thinking about our own history, because only when history touches ourselves personally, we can learn from it. So it was your great-grandfather, right? He was part of the German Wehrmacht and he was deployed in Kaunas. And of course that means that he also knew about the massacres and mass murder there, right? Well, sure. As far as we were able to research, he was in Kaunas in 1941 between June and August, and it was the time when the ghetto was established. And many murders took place at the time, many atrocities, and of course he was part of that, he saw it. And I am convinced that he also was an active part of it. And that means that your family, and maybe I can say it like that, it's not normal to be able to speak about this like this. Our own families were involved in the mass murder, were involved in the crimes of the German Wehrmacht in Kaunas, in Lithuania. And Kim Kash's father is an engineer, or used to work as an engineer, and he's been a pastor for many years now. And he also went to Kaunas to speak about this part of history, and we asked him to share, and we will hear him speak.
Hello, my name is
Guido Kasch. I'm pastor in the Lutheran Free Church in Tos in Tübingen, and for many years I did not know that my own family story was connected to Lithuania. Many years ago I was born and raised in a small village close to Tübingen on a farm, and of course my grandfather was living with us at the time, and he would tell me every now and then stories of the Second World War. But most of the time these were rather adventure stories. He was part of the cavalry and he had certain situations with his horse, and then he would share these adventure stories. And then early in the year 2000, in our church we started thinking about, what was the connection of our family's history with the time of National Socialism. And so I started researching, and my grandfather had died in the meantime, and I only knew that he had been in Russia during the war, but I didn't know anything beyond that. So then I turned to the German authorities and archives, and I received a letter that clearly and in great detail mentioned what he did during the Second World War. And there I was able to read that in 1941 he was in Kaunas in Lithuania. And so I started researching, what happened at the time. And I discovered that this was the very time when they set up a ghetto for Jews in Kaunas. And not only that, but also many Jews were murdered outside on a shooting square at the Ninth Fort. And that deeply, deeply troubled and shook me. The man that I grew up with for 20 years on this little farm, how he could have been part of this murder in Lithuania, in Kaunas. I had such a hard time believing that, and it deeply shook me inside. And not only that, but from Lithuania, he went on to St. Petersburg. And many know the story of Leningrad, which is St. Petersburg again, that there was a blockade for almost 3 years around the city, so no food supplies were able to get into the city. And more than 1 million people starved to death in the city. And my grandfather was involved in that. And that again shook me to the core, because he never mentioned those cities in all of his stories. He never spoke about Leningrad or Kaunas. And now I knew that he had been part of that murderous machinery. And today I can stand here and I want to tell each one of you, I am deeply sorry for what my grandfather did at the time, what he did to the Jewish people, but also for what he did to the people in Lithuania and in Leningrad. And I made a decision. I don't want to remain silent like my grandfather remained silent, but I want to name things for what they are. And my friends, I can truly tell you, this stirred a love to the people of God and to Israel in my heart. And therefore, I really wish Israel and of course all people in Lithuania, I wish you God's blessing and all the best.
Ja, das war Guido Kasch, Pastor in Deutschland.
Well, this was Guido Kasch, a pastor in Germany, and as many tens of thousands more, he broke the veil of silence over his own family history. And of course, we've got different countries and cultures, no problem. And it doesn't matter whether there was a history of victimization or of perpetrators in your nation. Even though politics might work through the past and remember, there is a culture of refusal to remember in our families that perpetuates anti-Semitism and hatred of Jews. And that's why it's so important that we personally think about this. The shadow of the Holocaust is on our generations until today. And so the veil of silence was transmitted to this day and prevents restoration and reconciliation in our own lives and also in our churches and congregations, and even in cities and nations. And in my book, I describe the different levels of the veil of silence. And I explain how these different levels can be viewed and how you can break through here. Of course, the first level is the level of family. So there are certain taboos in our families and people don't talk about things. And then there is the historic level. The way that we deal with our commemoration of history in society, in schools, and then there's the level of church history. We have to face 2,000 years of anti-Semitism and hatred of Jews and anti-Judaism in our churches that were transported into our nations. And then there is the level of prayer. How do we personally deal with this? It's the spiritual level. And then, of course, it is the question, how are we facing history in our own nation? Because history many times is a question of our ideological perspective or our national perspective and our national history. And then, of course, there is a biblical theological level that you can think about. And all these different levels we take a closer look at in my book. And now the question, where does this veil of silence come from? I answer this question in my book by looking into the effects of the veil of silence. The effects are present to this day. It has effects in our nations and cities, and I believe that many times our nations are covered by a veil or cloud of oppression, and we see this veil even in society. And someone says once that those who refuse to look at history cannot shape their future. And I believe there is a truth in that. And there are also effects in churches and denominations. Is it possible that many churches are so-called fridge churches because we never talked about history, we never worked through the past, and therefore history is still at work in us? Or maybe there are effects in marriages and families, troubled relationships, divorce that is passed on from generation to generation, even to the fact of abuse and violence that we can still see in our families to this day, and we are suffering from it. And then, of course, there is a working through the veil of silence in our own families. What is it like in our own lives? Anti-Semitism, hatred of Jews, anti-Israel attitudes. Psychologists have found that the long-term effects of the Holocaust are still seen to this very day. And in my 4th chapter of the book, I write about the generation of victims of the Second World War, whose traumatization is like a hereditary disease that is passed on to children and children's children. And also, the same thing applies to the silence of the perpetrators of the Second World War. They never spoke about their involvement and guilt. And somehow they tried to shake off any responsibility themselves. And they never spoke about their anti-Semitism and hatred of Jews, and they passed it on from generation to generation. And their children and grandchildren became neo-Nazis. They despised Jews or hated Israel. So traumas and fears can be passed on to the third and fourth generation. And children and grandchildren are asking themselves, where are those many things coming from that cannot be explained with their own biographies? Why are there so many topics in their families that are simply taboo and you can't talk about them? And in closing for my book, I describe exactly that. And I ask the question, how can we break the veil of silence? Maybe you have to find out yourself how you can do it in your own family. But in every nation, you have to apply this to your own life. But I believe it's helpful to recognize certain structures and principles that are applicable to any nation. So there are 5 levels of working through the past. I mentioned that before. Our personal lives, family, churches, denominations, city, the nation. And every one of those levels can be broken with 4 steps. Step number 1, facing the truth. Sometimes that's not so easy, but I need to face the truth about my family, the truth of my city, my nation, maybe even the truth that I experienced. And the second step of working through the past is the fact that I am shaken inside. Many times we can remain very distanced. We hear facts and numbers, but it doesn't concern us. We don't allow this to touch us. So the second step is so important. When we hear about the story and history of our own nation, Holocaust, mass shootings, pogroms, we need to allow this to touch us. Because behind every number and figure, there's a name, there's a family, there are fates and life stories that actually can and must touch us deeply. And the third step is an inner attitude of repentance, because many times this does something to us, or we act in a similar way as our ancestors did. We maybe remain silent like they did. There are certain patterns in our lives that are repeated. We don't want to realize things. And I believe there is a dimension before the living God that from the fact that we are shaken, we can ask forgiveness. And this helps us to receive healing and reconciliation. And then the next step is a confession. We do something about this, because every inner repentance and turning away from the past is only valuable as far as we turn away from our own patterns, and that's why it's so important. So at this point, I would like to address Samuel Haas. We saw him just now. Samuel Haas used to be a neo-Nazi, sounds terrible, but today he's a theologian and personal trainer, and he has broken the veil of silence in his own family. Samuel, maybe you can share your story. Well, neo-Nazi, I actually wouldn't have called myself that because I didn't have any political interest, but looking from the outside and at my actions, you would have said that. In my friends' groups, we welcomed each other with the Hitler salute. It was normal to joke about Jews, to imitate Hitler, to use the term Jew as a cuss word. I really had so many stereotypes against Jews or Israel, even though I didn't have any Jewish friends or didn't know any Jews. But it was present in my life. It was always there. But I didn't take it very seriously. I didn't realize it was there. Me and my friends, we talked like this in our everyday lives. But then my life kind of, when I was 17, 18 years old, turned out in a way that I really got into problems with drugs and alcohol. I had nightmares. And so many times with my drugs, I tried to suppress my dreams. When I woke up sweating at night, or I was like driven, I dreamt about situations of persecution or situations where I shot at people. And of course, they had no reason in my own biography. I'd never shot anyone. But I had these dreams, and they turned up in my life, and I had nightmares. And at one point, I told my parents about this, And my parents had started working through our family history. 3 of my great-grandfathers had been active part of the Second World War. They were perpetrators in the Holocaust. They destroyed Jewish life in Europe. And every now and then they would share with me. And then I visited my parents once. And for the first time, I told my mother about my dreams and how I was doing. And I told her about my nights. And then my mother sat down. I still remember that so clearly. And she asked me, you know what your grandfathers did during the war, and that's a heritage that's alive in you. And suddenly it became clear to me. In that moment, I understood that what I knew from school and from history lessons, that it actually was connected to me personally. So that means you carried part of your grandparents' history in your own life. So the question is, what kind of history was that? Well, it was the history of my great-grandfathers. 3 of my great-grandfathers were involved in the Second World War all over Europe. And I also have these documents by the German authorities that say that my great-grandfathers were in Poland, Russia, France, Italy. And you can really see the time, as Kim shared about her great-grandfather. And I found out, even through eyewitness reports, what kind of massacres took place at the time my great-grandfathers were there. And one of my great-grandfathers was stationed in Palmnicken at the Baltic Sea. And at the end of the war, there was one of the last death marches that ended there. 5,000 Jewish women who were marched to the Baltic Sea. 3,000 of them reached the Baltic Sea, and the soldiers were wondering what to do with them. So they shot at them, and with machine gun fire, they made them walk into the Baltic Sea. And my great-grandfather was there. They didn't talk a lot about this, but what my relatives shared with me later was that he was involved in that massacre. And that actually touched me so deeply, because I realized that's the truth of my life, of my family, and how personal this was still alive in me, because my family had never worked through that, well, or at least to that moment, because my parents then started working through the past. But then only I understood, even though I'm 4th generation, the effects were still present in my life, just like you shared, and how important it was to look at that truth and also to speak about the truth, in order for history not to repeat itself like it did in my own life. So I changed my behavior, my actions, and my life changed. And you talk about this, you sing about it. And one of the songs that you have written is Light, and also Kim is a musician, she plays the violin. And so you love playing Jewish music, Jewish songs, together with others. You wouldn't have to do that, right? So you are raising your voices against anti-Semitism and hatred of Jews. And so that is visible in all of the generations here, especially at this time. So what is your song Light all about? Well, the song Light actually speaks about this process. Yeah, I have 3 verses that I address to the 3 levels, how I discovered this in my own life, on the surface. At first, the prejudices I had, and then the second verse speaks about the level of family, the different levels of the veil of silence that you spoke about, where I discovered the guilt and history of my own family and allowed this to touch me. And then the third verse speaks about the fact that I'm a Christian today, and even as a Christian there is anti-Judaism and hatred of Jews, and that laid the foundations for history as it went. And it ends with a statement that we need to raise our voices. It is important that we speak the truth, because the truth gets a face like that, and it's not just a history lesson, and it becomes personal. And so it's a challenge to people to actually do something about the situation. Well, thank you so much, Samuel. Samuel worked through his own family history and broke through the veil of silence in his family, and he made it a statement against anti-Semitism and hatred of Jews. And let's watch the video.
Ich hab gelernt, dass nur die Wahrheit was verändert. Manchmal ist sie schmerzhaft, doch Lüge ist in Wahrheit nur ein Kerker. Schweigen ist der Wärter, kein Gegner ist härter. Ich will erzählen, was mich das gelehrt hat. Ich hab gemerkt, dass ich geizige Menschen Juden nannte, obwohl ich nicht einen einzigen Juden kannte. Hab gedacht, Juden erkennt man an der Nase, stellte meine Vorurteile lange nicht in Frage. Shoah wurde unterrichtet in der Klasse, doch 6 Millionen Morde sind zu viele, sie zu fassen. Das ist Geschichte, aber mir fehlt der Bezug. Ich bin Mitte 20, was hat das mit mir zu tun? Ja klar, kann man ja verstehen, Vergangenheit soll ruhen, wenn man jung ist, will man leben. So einfach ist es nicht, es brauchte, bis ich merkte, diese Prägung ist ein Erbe, denn es lebt in meinem Herzen. Sprich, werde Licht, und dir bekommt die Wahrheit ein Gesicht. Es zählt, was du tust oder nicht, für einen neuen Weg braucht es einen neuen Schritt. Sprich, werde Licht, und dir bekommt die Wahrheit ein Gesicht. Es zählt, was du tust oder nicht, für einen neuen Weg braucht es einen neuen Schritt. Es ist wichtig, was heute ist. Für einen neuen Weg braucht es einen neuen Schritt. Es reicht nicht aus, sich auf die Zukunft zu fokussieren. Wer seine Zukunft kennen möchte, muss wissen, wo seine Wurzeln liegen. Also fing ich an zu recherchieren. Meine Linie waren Nazis, Soldaten, Offiziere. Das ist meine Familie. Mörder, Vergewaltiger und Diebe, die Juden gejagt haben wie Tiere. Und nach dem Krieg haben die Väter dann geschwiegen. Reden ist Silber, Schweigen ist Gold, was? Ich kann nicht glauben, dass das ja keiner gewollt hat. Ich zeige auf niemanden mit dem Finger, doch die Lügen über Juden leben heute in ihren Kindern. Es ist wichtig, was ich damit mache, denn ich merke, diese Prägung ist ein Erbe, denn es lebt in meinem Herzen. Sprich, werde Licht, und dir bekommt die Wahrheit ein Gesicht. Es zählt, was du tust oder nicht, für einen neuen Weg braucht es einen neuen Schritt. Sprich, werde Licht, und dir bekommt die Wahrheit ein Gesicht. Es zählt, was du tust oder nicht, für einen neuen Weg braucht es einen neuen Schritt. Heute bin ich Theologe und ich bin Christ, doch die besseren Menschen sind das jetzt nicht. Schon die Kirchenväter und die ersten Theologen haben gelogen über Juden und die Schuld auf sie geschoben. Und diese Vorurteile führten zu Pogromen. Der Antijudaismus steht auf religiösem Boden. Martin Luther hätte sie vertrieben und bestohlen, hat gesagt, man sollte Feuer legen in den Synagogen. 2000 Jahre verfolgten die Christen Juden hart, obwohl Jesus Jude war. Eigentlich sollten wir eingesetzt werden in den Baum, doch wir kappten die Wurzel und die Blätter wurden braun. Ich sehe nicht, dass die Zeit Wunden geheilt hat und glaube nicht, dass Arbeit, sondern Wahrheit frei macht. Heute ist entscheidend, was ich mache, denn ich merke, diese Prägung ist ein Erbe, denn es lebt in meinem Herzen. Sprich, werde Licht, mit dir bekommt die Wahrheit ein Gesicht. Es zählt, was du tust oder nicht, für einen neuen Weg braucht es einen neuen Schritt. Sprich, werde Licht, mit dir bekommt die Wahrheit ein Gesicht. Es zählt, was du tust oder nicht, für einen neuen Weg braucht es einen neuen Schritt. Sprich, werde Licht, mit dir bekommt die Wahrheit ein Gesicht. Es zählt, was du tust oder nicht, für einen neuen Weg braucht es einen neuen Schritt. Sprich, werde Licht, mit dir bekommt die Wahrheit ein Gesicht. Es zählt, was du tust oder nicht, für einen neuen Weg braucht es einen neuen Schritt.
Ja, das war Sammy Haas.
Well, this was Samuel Haas. He breaks the veil of silence. And next to me there is Kim and Samuel, and I'm glad to have you with me in the studio. Kim, you're also a musician, and you have already played in front of many Holocaust survivors. You play the violin, you sing. How did they respond to you? Well, you really have to say it's very varied. Of course, everyone personally comes with their own story and their way of dealing with it. But for me, it's really special as a German to be able to sing Hebrew or Yiddish songs or play them. Because just like you mentioned, we did research in our families. And I know that all of my 4 great-grandfathers were part of the Wehrmacht, and especially in Eastern Europe, almost every country there, one of my great-grandfathers was there in the war. And what happened was that Jewish life and culture was destroyed there. And now to have the possibility of honoring this culture through music and to kind of return some of the life there is very moving for me, and of course for the Holocaust survivors themselves as well, the people that we meet and encounter. And many in your generation or even older generations say, wow, just stop talking about the Holocaust, finish it, stop talking about it. And you could do other things as well. You could play different kind of music. But why don't you end it? Why still do you speak about this? Why is it important? Well, of course, it's true, it's a long time ago, but from my own experience, I can say that anti-Semitism is still present in Germany. Maybe not every day and not everywhere, but in school, I experienced this. I went to school with a necklace like this, with a Star of David, and a school fellow told me to go back to the gas chambers. And so, unfortunately, these situations are still present. And so it's all the more important to raise our voices and to speak the truth even about our families that wouldn't be spoken about otherwise. So that's really important. Kim Kash is breaking the veil of silence. And even just by wearing a Star of David, it's unbelievable to see what is happening in anti-Semitism and hatred of Jews in all nations. You can truly see an explosion of anti-Semitism. So we must not stop talking about the Holocaust and the events of the Second World War. And that's why places of remembrance are so important. That's why it's so important for us also to learn to break the veil of silence in our families. So, to see the story of this book, let me show you this book once again. I really think the cover design is very fitting. And so, in how far this is applicable and important to your nation, you need to find out yourself. Well, best thing is by reading the book, but I believe that this can stir you into thinking. And when I look to Germany, I can say one thing: to have a self-critical working through of the past, despite all the official commemoration and historic working through the past, never happened. And even scientists agree with me here. There is a commissioner for anti-Semitism and social researcher who said the following thing. He said, in Germany, or maybe you can apply this to your own nation, you have to see that, whether that works. But he said, in Germany, there is a guilt that begins much earlier than actual murder. It is a guilt that almost no German family is free of. And that was that the majority of the children and grandchildren never worked through their family history. So that is the guilt that he speaks about. Or he said that the history of one's own family were actually downplayed or downright denied. So this is what this social researcher says. This guilt in the family is what he calls the refusal to remember. And then he continues that this actually violates the victims one more time. It is the violence of refusal to remember and the violence of forgetting. So the silence actually protected the perpetrators during the time of National Socialism. And so this refusal to remember is then passed on to the generation of children and grandchildren. And another quote here: this unconscious knowledge of the family secret is the psychological heritage of anti-Semitism that weighs on the children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren of the perpetrators. So that is quite a powerful thesis he has here, but all of this actually causes us to realize that we need to learn how to break the veil of silence in our own personal lives, families, and nations. And so, if we want to be successful in combating anti-Semitic thought, we need to overcome our own victim myth. That's what the social researcher says. And we need to start thinking about our own private recollections. Real history and fiction are many times mixed or confused, and there is a desire to wash oneself free of guilt and ignores the suffering of the victims. So this refusal to remember is a burden that weighs on the German family histories like a heavy shadow. And as far as I could observe, it's also present in many different nations, maybe also in your nation. It is like a burden on your own family history. The book about breaking the veil of silence can be an encouragement and help to start facing one's own family history. So I would recommend to you to read it and to come to your own judgment about this. And so I wish you all the best and God's blessing. Thank you so much.